Hey guys, welcome to my Rear Window review. A classic movie that you should see if you haven't, but might feel like you've already have. This film has been borrowed from and referenced in the past before. In the early 90s, The Simpsons did a parody episode. The movie Fright Night borrowed some elements from it. And the movie Disturbia can be argued as a modern day remake of this film. Now, this is my first, at least semi scripted review, so I got a few points I'm going to be going by here, so just bear with me. First, I want to talk about how this film has kind of a play like structure. It begins with the curtains rising to Jimmy Stewart's apartment, and we get a look at the stage this film is set on, which, to the film's credit, does a great job making it look like a real city. The sound effects, the background, there's even an alleyway with a restaurant that looks and feels like an actual place. I mean, an actual city. The alleyway, there's people walking by, there's stuff going on in the restaurant constantly, and I'm perfectly willing to accept this isn't a soundstage, it's an actual city. It feels like it. Now, the premise of the movie, Jimmy Stewart is a cameraman who got his leg broken photographing a car crash during a race, and you see a photo in his apartment. He was head on taking the photo, and he gets bored and begins to watch his neighbors, which leads to the trouble because he believes one killed his wife. Now, I want to talk about three of the neighbors in particular. I'll get to them in a minute. Now, we get the camera where it never leaves Jimmy Stewart's apartment, even at the end when he is forcefully removed. The camera stays in the apartment, and this is important because Jimmy Stewart's bored, he's cooped up, that's why he's watching the neighbors, and it helps you relate to him, and it does kind of make you wonder, did it really happen, or is Jimmy Stewart just so bored his imagination's running away with him? He has a nurse played by Thelma Ritter who does a phenomenal job. There's points in this movie where she even absolutely steals the scene from him. Her introduction, where she takes control of the scene. She's basically scolding him for looking out the window, telling him, you got a good woman, you need to marry her, so on and so forth. And this is a woman played by Grace Kelly who he's intimidated by. He's like, she's too perfect, and she's like, I can hear you now. Get out of my life, you perfect thing. You're too good for me. And this plays into my next point. I'm going to bring up three of the neighbors: Miss Torso, Miss Lonely Heart, and the piano player. When Jimmy Stewart looks at Miss Torso, he sees the eat, drink, and be merry type. She can have any man she wants over. But his girlfriend, played by Grace Kelly, sees right through it. She's like, no, she's doing a woman's most difficult job, juggling wolves. And it turns out she's a ballet dancer. The people she has over, she's trying to advance her career. At the end of the movie, we see she has a husband. He's shorter than her. He could be thought of as beneath her stature, but they're happy and in love. She's there to remind him that nothing is as it seems. Next is Miss Lonely Heart, who's there to remind Jimmy Stewart, who's become so set in his ways, he's a photographer that travels the world. She's there to remind him what happens if you get too set in your ways and you push people away. Throughout the film, we see her basically in her apartment, and she'll set things up like she's having a date over, but it's only her. Later on in the film, we see she has a date, and the guy forces himself on her, and she runs him off, and she's also there to remind Jimmy Stewart, you have to stay by your convictions. You have to have standards. Even though she's miserably lonely, she wants to be loved, but she wants to be respected, and she's not going to tolerate what happened to her. There's an incredibly dark scene towards the climax where it's strongly hinted at she's contemplating suicide. I'll touch up on that in a minute. And the piano player, who we see stressing out throughout the entire film about getting this song to be just perfect. He's there to remind Jimmy Stewart that nothing's perfect, aka your girlfriend is not too perfect for you. She's flawed too. Getting on the girlfriend, Grace Kelly, and I love the way Alfred Hitchcock introduces us to her in this film. I think this is Hitchcock's finest movie, by the way. But first, we see an extreme close up of her, and then her shadow casted over Jimmy Stewart's face, which helps sell that. You can tell he's intimidated by how perfect she thinks he thinks she is. So she comes over, they have a date. She's wearing an expensive dress and even mentions, I couldn't afford it. Basically, she works at a clothing store, and I get she can borrow these clothes as long as she models and advertises them. And she's like, this is your last week in a cast. Even if I had to pay the $1,100, it would be worth it. She has a dinner brought over from a fancy restaurant, and they have a fight because she just wants to be more a part of his life, and he's not really comfortable with settling down yet. He's trying to be honest about how hard the life is, and she's like, I got connections. You can open a studio. I can get you big clients. And they have a fight, and she hints she'll be back tomorrow. Later on that night, Jimmy Stewart you hear like a scream and a thud, and he goes to sleep. He wakes up in the rain, and I love some of the humor dispersed through this movie. There's a couple, because there's a heat wave, sleeping on their fire escape. Well, they're in a rush to get in their apartment because of the rain. They drop their alarm clock, it crashes to the ground and goes off, and as they're struggling to get the bed through the window, the husband falls through the window, and Jimmy Stewart gets a chuckle. Then he notices the neighbor that he begins to suspect killed his wife, who we see nagging him a lot earlier in the film. He's making an awful lot of trips in and out in the rain, and he's doing it till like 3:30 or later in the morning. And this is where he begins to suspect. The next night, he gets Grace Kelly slowly on board with him. He eventually even gets Thelma Ritter, the nurse, on board with him, and she tries to get the name of this delivery truck as it's driving off. The next day, he also sees the wife's nowhere to be found, and this is where his imagination really begins to run wild. And it does look strongly implied, but we also see things to hint at she may not have done it, so it makes you wonder, did it happen, or is Jimmy Stewart just so bored that he's concocting this in his mind to have something to do? Because in the beginning, on a phone conversation, not a phone conversation with the nurse, he mentioned, I'll welcome trouble at this point, I'm so bored. Well, he calls a detective friend. The detective friend gets a postcard, and it was supposedly from his wife from a location. Later on that night, he mentions that she was seen getting off this train, and at this point, Jimmy Stewart's feeling kind of down, and there's the Rear Window ethics scene. Him and Grace Kelly are discussing. He's like, do you suppose, even if it's wrong to spy on your neighbor, it's right if you can prove he committed a murder? And it's asking the ethics of spying on your neighbors and whatnot, and he concludes, well, It's fine in this case because if I can do it, I can take it. Because I'm trapped in this apartment. They can watch me like a bug under glass, and I can't do a thing about it. And it's a neat scene, and it discusses the ethics about it. I lived in a housing authority situation for a while, and I can tell you, there's neighbors that think they're Jimmy Stewart in this movie. If you go in with name brand soda instead of the off brand, the whole neighborhood will know about it. Anyway, that night they wake up to screaming. The fire escape couple, their dog has been murdered. The dog was seen earlier in the film digging through Thorwald's flower bed. Well, Jimmy Stewart notices something, that the only neighbor that didn't come to the window to check it out was Thorwald, and all we see is the ember of a cigarette. So at this point, we know it's him. This is the beyond confirmation point. Hold on a second. So as the film begins to ramp up, both Grace Kelly and Thelma Ritter are on board. Jimmy Stewart discovers this picture, and he notices the flowers have shrunk. So the dog, yeah, it was snooping around, but Thorwald must have dug the flowers up and put them back in. What did he bury under there? Why, Thorwald leaves. Grace Kelly and Thelma Ritter go to dig up the flower bed. They find nothing. Grace Kelly sneaks in his apartment. She ultimately winds up getting arrested because Jimmy Stewart calls the cops. And then she signals, "Look, I found the wedding ring." Well, Thorwald comes to Stewart's apartment. He takes his camera, starts taking pictures to use the flash to stun him. Thorwald goes to throw Jimmy Stewart out of the apartment, and he screams. And he gets thrown out. The police catch him. Thorwald gets arrested, confessed. The next scene, Grace Kelly's in the apartment. We see the tie-up and resolve with some of the other characters, like Miss Lonely Hearts in the apartment of the piano player, and she's talking about his music, and it's hinted she may get her happy ending after all. The curtains lower, just like they raised in the beginning of the movie, which makes it feel like a Broadway play in some ways, and I like that structure. And I think a lot of the neighbors were stage actors. This film is just great. It's at its core, it's about a murder helping two people with relationship troubles. The nurse is the voice of reason throughout most of it, telling him, look, y'all are not too perfect for each other. When two people are in love, bam, it's like two taxis hitting each other. And at that point, he's still hesitant. And it's just neat to see this structure. How many movies can you say the relationship problem is fixed by solving a murder? This, I think, is Hitchcock's best movie and one of my all-time favorite movies. This is a must-see. It gets my highest recommendation. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Over and out.